Well, let's go ahead and get started. We're 3 minutes after the hour, and I don't want to keep people long on a Tuesday night. But hi, everyone. My name is Audrey DeRose-Wilson, and I am the new director of bird conservation for Audubon, Florida. I'm sure a lot of you knew Marianne Carosi and still know her, and hopefully we'll get to interact with her on JWatch a bit as well still. But I joined Audubon last fall when Marianne retired. Just a little bit about me. I've been working with birds in a professional capacity since 2003, which I realize shockingly is nearly 20 years. Recently, a lot of that work has been with shorebirds, and that's still a big part of what I do at Audubon. Scrub jays are a new species for me, but I started out my career working with forest and grassland passerines. So I'm really excited to get to spend some time with birds away from the beach and learn more about Florida scrub jays. I am here today with Erica Zambello, who's our Director of Communications for Audubon, Florida, and Jackie Sulik, who I'm sure needs no introduction for many of you. She's our JWatch coordinator. Jackie and I will be presenting this evening, and Erica is going to be helping out behind the scenes with questions and providing tech support. So before I get started, just a few housekeeping things. Please put yourself on mute and stay on mute during the presentation. If you have questions, you can put those in the chat. And after the presentation, Erica will read as many of your questions as we have time for, and Jackie and I will answer them. If you do have any technical issues, go ahead and put those in the chat and Erica will help you out. We're going to have two presentations this evening. I'll go first, and then there'll be time for questions after my presentation, time for a short break, and then Jackie will do her presentation on JWatch survey methods. I think that's all the housekeeping we have. So with that, I'll get into it. I'm really excited to share a short primer on Florida scrub jays. Florida scrub jays have been studied by Archibald Biological Station and others for close to 50 years now. So it's going to be impossible for me to do justice to that body of knowledge in the next hour. But just know that there's much more, and this will give you a brief introduction. So first, a little bit of an overview. Florida scrub jays are endemic to Florida. This means they only occur in Florida. They're listed as federally threatened. They're not listed as endangered at this point. They were listed in 1987 due to population declines and loss of habitat, scrub habitat specifically, which is the only place that these birds live. They're not migratory, so they don't fly south or return in the spring. In fact, they're really homebodies, and they rarely move more than 2 miles from where they hatched, depending on habitat availability. They defend their territories year-round, although in the winter, when they're searching for food, they don't defend territories quite as vociferously as they do during the breeding season. One of the more fascinating things about Florida scrub jays is that they're cooperative breeders. Other scrub jays, like the California and Woodhouse scrub jay, are not cooperative breeders. So cooperative breeding is a particular adaptation due to limited habitat in Florida, where there's only so much scrub habitat. Cooperative breeders are also rare among birds in general. They only number about 2% of the world's 10,000 or so bird species. And we refer to the cooperative breeding groups as family groups. At the core of the group, there's a breeding pair, and then there's one or more helper birds. These helpers are usually, but not always, the surviving offspring from previous years from the breeding pair. Sometimes there can be unrelated birds that move around on the landscape and are accepted into a family, but usually it's older siblings helping their parents raise younger siblings. And within a family group, there can be up to 6 helpers in addition to the male and female breeding adults. The function of these helpers is to look for danger, especially during the breeding season. Helper birds can also help feed nestlings and juveniles until they're up to about 3 months old. And the research is really clear on the success of the cooperative breeding strategy for Florida scrub jays. Breeding birds that have helpers produce more offspring than pairs with no helpers. And this is because if there's just the breeding pair, that leaves one bird to watch for danger while the other looks for food. So there's only one set of eyes watching for danger. And both adults also have to feed themselves. So cooperative breeding is a really successful strategy for Florida scrub jays. And this strategy is also one of the things that makes Florida scrub jays so much fun to watch. They're really social birds. There's always something going on within a group and between family groups. So a little bit about their nests and eggs. Typically, scrub jays nest in a scrub oak that's about 4 to 6 feet tall. Most often, this nest tree will have some space around it, which allows the adults to look for danger before it gets to the nest. When they're building the nest, the male brings sticks that form the outer structure of the nest, and the female weaves the inner part of the nest out of soft fibers, like fibers from palmetto fronds. And nest building begins in February through April, with most birds starting their nests in March. The first broods are laid anywhere from March to May. And if the first nest fails, the birds will try again and again, maybe. But if they don't have success until sometime in June, then they'll stop trying. If the first brood is successful, they won't try to have a second brood because the juveniles are dependent for a long time after they fledge. And there's typically no active nests remaining into July. They've either failed or hatched, and they lay 2 to 5 eggs per clutch. And just as a note, you need a federal research permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to take photos of eggs or nests. So please do not take photos like the one you see on the slide here. Even if you know where a nest is, don't approach and flush the birds off to take a photo. So a little bit about the breeding timeline. The male will feed the female while she's on the nests. Helper birds do not feed the female while she's incubating, and she will incubate for 15 to 17 days until the eggs hatch. And then in another 18 days or so, the nestlings will get big enough to leave the nest. But they'll hang around that scrub oak undercover for another 2 weeks until they can fly well. And then they're not fully independent until about 3 months after hatching. This is a beautiful picture, but it's also what people would call a branchling, which is a nestling that's old enough to be out of the nest, but this bird can't fly yet. You can see how its wing feathers are a little bit too short and the tail's not fully grown in. And you can also see this bird is begging for food, which is something you can sometimes hear when you're on site and near young birds. They're pretty noisy. So I'll just mention a little bit about identifying adults and juveniles. Jackie is going to cover this in more depth in her talk this evening, where we'll look at more slides of adults and juveniles. The main way we tell adults and juveniles apart is by looking at the brown on the back of their head and on their neck. So this slide has got 3 adults and 3 juveniles. And here are the 3 juveniles identified. Another way that you can tell adults and juveniles apart is that adults have a gray patch on their back, which if you look at the furthest left adult in this picture, you can see a little bit of that gray patch above its wing. Then if you look at the middle juvenile, there's no gray patch. It's just brown all the way down the back. So you can look for this break in color on the back of the neck, even in poor lighting. And if you don't see it, that bird is likely a juvenile. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what scrub jays eat. During the breeding season, ideally, they're eating arthropods, caterpillars, spiders, other small insects, though they'll also eat small vertebrates like frogs and lizards and toads, basically anything that is protein rich that they can swallow. This high protein, low fiber food is what the juveniles are fed. Acorns have too much fiber and they would fill the juveniles up too quickly because they need a lot of protein to grow quickly. But in the fall and winter, especially during cold periods, scrub jays eat acorns, and they've harvested those acorns annually. In the fall, they began harvesting acorns and caching them or burying them in the sand. And an efficient scrub jay can bury 6,500 to 8,000 acorns and then relocate about 80% of them, according to research. And scrub jays, like other corvids, just have outstandingly good spatial memory. So they can recognize and remember landscape features, whether that's sand patches or sticks or shrubs or plants, whatever cues they're using, they're just extraordinarily good at spatial recognition and memory. So that's how they refined all of their cached acorns. Some interesting information about acorns. They differ in terms of tannin content. White oak acorns have lower tannin content and red oaks have higher tannin content. What is important about the tannin is that it interferes with protein metabolism. So the protein in the acorns is what the jays need, but it's harder to metabolize that protein if there's a lot of tannin present. So the interesting thing is that Florida scrub jays can tell the difference between acorns with lower and higher tannin content, and they preferentially eat the acorns with lower tannin content and preferentially cache the acorns with higher tannin content. And then through the fall and winter months, as it rains and the rain percolates through the sand, it mobilizes some of that tannin in the acorns and diffuses it into the surrounding sand. So the acorns actually become more edible later in the winter. And because the Florida scrub jays remember where most of their acorns are, they'll continually go through that cache within their territory and tend to their acorn garden like we would tend to a vegetable garden. So they'll periodically dig up acorns that they've cached and see if they're rotting. And if they're rotting and they're too wet, they'll throw them away. But if they're just slightly damp, they might move them to another spot that's a little higher and drier and recache them for later. So this is one of the ways that they occupy their time in the fall and winter is tending to their food supply like this. Scrub habitat needs to be in optimal condition to support breeding success for Florida scrub jays. And as an aside, this is an old photo. We continue to use it because it illustrates optimal scrubs so well. But I would challenge all of you who are helping out with scrub jay surveys this year to get us an updated photo with a person in it for scale that shows the characteristics of scrub that are optimal for scrub jays. So these characteristics are oak shrubs that are 4 to 6 feet tall, very few trees. You can have a few pine trees, but more than a couple or 3 per acre provide too many perches for raptors that are predators of jays. And then what's super important are these bare sandy patches, because that's where the Florida scrub jays are going to cache their acorns. This, in contrast, is overgrown habitat, which I'm sure you have all seen. This is a result of fire exclusion. When fire is excluded, the scrub oaks will grow together, so there aren't any bare sandy patches. And you can also get a closed or semi-closed canopy of sand pines overhead. Sand pines grow really fast and can pretty quickly overtake scrub habitat, and then they drop their needles, which further cover up these bare sandy patches. And some of the very first research on scrub jays showed that scrub jays were more successful in habitats with periodic fire. On this slide, if you look at this figure on the right side of it, you have open low habitat, and then to the left of that, dense tall habitat. The open low habitat is optimal for scrub jays, while the dense tall habitat is too overgrown. And if you look down at the red box, you can see that the number of fledglings and the survival of juveniles through their first winter and spring is much higher in that open low habitat that's maintained by fire. So why is that? This is some more recent research from Archbold Biological Station, and I'll walk you through the key parts of this graph. If you look at the top half, you're looking at optimal habitat. That's that low open habitat. On the bottom half of the graph, you're looking at overgrown habitat. So this graph compares in the bars the amount of time that adults spend foraging and looking for danger, or in vigilance. Vigilance is the gray bar and foraging is the black bar. So you can see that when scrub jays have eggs, they spend about the same amount of time on foraging and vigilance, regardless of if they're in that optimal habitat or overgrown habitat. And the pattern looks the same on the top half of the figure as the bottom half. But the big difference is here when their eggs have hatched and there are nestlings that need to be fed. So now the adults need to feed the nestlings and they need to feed themselves constantly. But in the dense overgrown habitat, the adults know there's danger, especially to those nestlings, which can be loud. Remember that photo of the begging nestling or branchling that couldn't fly yet. And the nestlings need to be fed, but the adults are spending too much time being vigilant, either looking around for danger or quieting the nestlings when there's a predator, for instance, a Cooper's hawk nearby. So the nestlings don't get fed as much and their survival is much lower because the adults are spending too much time being aware of danger instead of feeding the kids. So how do we deal with dense habitat? One way is with heavy machinery. Sometimes this is the most expedient or even only option for managing tall, dense scrub habitat to make it more suitable for scrub jays and other scrub-dependent species. So mechanical equipment like this hydrax can be used to cut and mulch the trees. But the trouble with this approach is that it takes everything. It takes all of the cover and reduces it to ground level. So it has to regrow to the point that the oaks are large enough to produce acorns before it can provide cover and nesting habitat for scrub jays. The real fix is fire. And I'm sure you all know that the Florida Peninsula has an extraordinary high number of lightning strikes. Some of you might be experiencing that now, depending on where in the state you are, especially in the summer months that we're entering into now. So scrub habitat evolved in a lightning ecology. The same thing for a lot of other habitats in Florida, like the dry prairie, dry flatwoods, and longleaf pine habitats. All of these are fire dependent. And in Florida, there's also a long history of people using fire to manage and restore habitat. Indigenous peoples use prescribed fire to maintain these fire-dependent habitats, and European settlers adopted those practices. But then in the early 1900s, there were changes in how the landscape was being used. More grazing meant less fuel on the landscape, and Forest Service policy and urbanization all worked together to exclude fire from the landscape. Because we no longer tolerate ignited fires and because we put them out quickly so they don't endanger residences and commercial areas, we now have to rely on prescribed fire to maintain Florida's fire-dependent habitats like the Florida scrub. The fire rotation that's needed varies depending on which habitat's being maintained. So longleaf pine and dry prairie need to be burned every 1 to 2 years, but scrub grows more slowly and needs to be burned only every 5 to 20 years. And these longer rotations are necessary to accommodate rare scrub plants like Florida rosemary, which set seed about every 15 years. So you can see if you burn more frequently than every 15 years, eventually you will lose all of the Florida rosemary. So this varied burn rotation is used to maintain diversity. And coastal scrub also gets more rainfall than scrub in the interior of the peninsula. So the fire rotations are shorter in coastal scrub because it grows faster than in the central part of Florida. Prescribed fires are ideally low-level fires. They're not intense and not jumping to the canopy. This is how scrub burns when it lacks what fire ecologists would call ladder fuel. Ladder fuel, LADDER, is a mid-story canopy. So you want the fire to stay on the ground, but if you have a mid-story canopy, then the fire can get into that, and then from that into the upper canopy, and that's not what you want. So sometimes mechanical treatment can be used to reduce that mid-story canopy so the scrub can be burnt with the fire staying on the ground. And on the right side here, you see recently burned habitat. Scrub regrows very quickly. It takes roughly 3 to 5 years, maybe even a little faster on the coast after a burn before scrub can be usable again by scrub jays. This is a figure prepared by Archbold Biological Station, which shows the tight correlation between breeding success, number of scrub jays, and incidence of fire. So when the number of jays starts to decline, this is correlated with habitat becoming overgrown. Then when you burn it, quickly you can see the number of scrub jay families increases, and the cycle just keeps repeating itself. This close relationship is one of the top reasons why Florida scrub jays are used as a habitat condition indicator, and why our Jay Watch program is formed around them. Because by monitoring the number of scrub jays, family groups, and breeding success, this information tells site managers when they need to burn to maintain scrub habitat, not just for jays, but for a lot of other species. Habitat condition indicator means that what is good for the Florida scrub jay is also good for many other federally and state listed endemic plants and animals. This is just a partial list. I think there are 50 some species of plants and animals that only live in the Florida scrub. And we monitor the scrub jays to give us an indication about the quality of the habitat for all of those other species and the scrub ecosystem, as well as for scrub jays. This is a map of sites where scrub jays occur throughout the state. And you'll notice an interesting pattern. There's a real linear nature to where scrub jays occur. The lines along the coast are coastal ridges in Florida today, but you can see that same linear pattern in the interior part of the state. And these are very ancient sand dunes. This is the former coastal dune systems when part of what is land now was covered by water. So the linear feature that you see in eastern Marion County, that's the scrubby flatwoods area that comprises Ocala National Forest. And then in Polk, Osceola, and Highlands County, the linear features there are the Lake Wales Ridge. If you've participated in this training in the last 2 years, you've probably seen this status update from 2019 already, but it's the most recent assessment that we have. The gray shaded area in Northwest and South Florida are areas with no historical records to indicate the Florida scrub jay ever lived there. So this is not part of their range as we know it. You can also see, if you look at the northern part of the map, that scrub jays have never lived anywhere but in Florida. They don't extend any further north. The red signifies counties that used to have Florida scrub jays, but where they're now extirpated. And then there's a gradation of colors signifying how many groups of scrub jays are present. And for now, note in particular those blue counties. These are the remaining hotspots. So the largest populations of scrub jays in the state, and these include Ocala National Forest, which has the largest population of scrub jays, about 1,000 family groups. And since the census, the National Forest has been managing to create more scrub habitat for jays. And then at Cape Canaveral, Merritt Island, Kennedy Space Center, and in mainland Brevard County, there are lots of jays. Lake Wales Ridge also has lots of properties with scrub jays, and this is where Archbold Biological Station is. And although this is from 2019, things have not changed a lot since then. In terms of overall population, once upon a time, there were nearly 40,000 scrub jays in Florida. But by 1987, when they were federally listed, the number had dropped to about half that, and the numbers continued to decline. So there were statewide censuses on publicly owned land, so nothing on private lands, just publicly owned lands, that were published in 1992 and 2011. I think the data for the 2011 census was actually collected in 2009, but published in 2011. We would like to do another statewide census, and we actually had one planned a few years ago for 2020, but you all know what happened in 2020, and we were all busy coping with the pandemic and didn't do the census that year. So we're still planning to organize a census in the future. We're hoping that with all of the land management that Florida State Parks and the National Forest Service and FWC have been doing, FWC is Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, that we will have started to flex that curve back up, and we'll have increasing numbers, at least on public lands where this management is happening. Lots of people ask, how many groups do you need to have a stable population? We know that we need to have at least 40 family groups on a site. If there's not a large tract of scrub that makes up one site, you can have several small tracts of scrub that are fairly close together that make up something that will function as a site complex. If you remember, I said most scrub jays spend their lives within a couple miles of where they're hatched. So if you have these smaller sites, they have to be within a few miles of each other to function like one large site, so that scrub jays can find other sites and find mates when they're ready to breed. In Jaywatch, we do survey a lot of sites with fewer than 40 family groups, and we are seeing slow declines at these sites. Here's some of the reasons why. Big threats to Florida scrub jays. They prefer nice sandy upland areas, but people also like to build houses in these nice sandy, well-drained areas. And then in Florida, there's a lot of citrus. Citrus prefer to have well-drained roots and need to be someplace warm. So the citrus industry has moved into sandy upland habitat in the southern part of the state. Then there are other threats that come with development. There are certain predators that are much more abundant in urban and suburban areas, like Cooper's hawks and raccoons, and of course, cats. Another question that people wonder about is which raptors are predators of scrub jays. On the left, we have some birds that are predators of scrub jays: red-shouldered hawks, Cooper's hawks, great horned owls, and surprisingly to me, swallow-tailed kites. But I hear that Marianne has actually seen this herself. Also possibly barred owls, although they probably don't overlap too much with scrub jays because barred owls are active at night and scrub jays in the daytime. But I think Jackie is going to go into some more detail in her presentation about these predators and maybe show some pictures. But the take home here is if you're doing a playback and you see any of these species that can be predators of scrub jays, you need to stop so that you're not drawing them into the same area where the scrub jays are. And then on the right side, you have vultures, eagles, ospreys, and red-tailed hawks. These are not predators of concern to Florida scrub jays. Unfortunately, scrub jays typically don't do well in a suburban or urban landscape. Florida scrub jays will visit feeders, and the problem is less what they are eating and more that they might be drawn to areas where they're exposed to threats like outdoor cats, or if they're crossing roads to get to the feeder, they can get hit by cars. So it's not beneficial to draw scrub jays into bird feeders. Another question that we get a lot is it okay to feed peanuts to Florida scrub jays? Technically, it's against federal law. According to Dr. Reed Bowman at Archbold Biological Station, peanuts aren't detrimental to adult scrub jays, but they are detrimental to juvenile scrub jays. Peanuts have a lot of fiber in them, and this fills the juveniles up without providing enough protein. So remember when I said the juvenile scrub jays need a high protein diet of arthropods and frogs and things like that to grow quickly. So the risk of feeding peanuts in the spring and summer is that the adults might take them and feed them to the young, or they might cache them and take them to the young later. So it's just not a good idea. Also, this draws scrub jays into people. And as we saw on the last slide, that's not a good idea because they can be exposed to cats and rodents and other threats. So this is just something to be aware of and to be very careful about. This slide and the next illustrate what has happened to scrub habitat in Florida. The red outline on this slide is Lyonia Preserve, which is about 300 acres in Deltona and Volusia County. And you can see the white areas showing through in this aerial imagery. That's all white sand. So we can see that this was once scrub before Deltona was built. And this aerial image is from 1943. But this is how Deltona looks now. It's heavily urbanized all around the preserve. And this is the fate of many scrub preserves throughout the state. Lyonia actually has been fairly well preserved, and there are still scrub jays there, but the number of jays is declining. And if you look within the preserve now, you see these wide swaths across the landscape. That's mowing because they're having to roller disc to maintain some open sandy habitat. And that's because you can only burn at this site on days when there is no wind and the smoke goes straight up. Because if the smoke goes in any direction, somebody is going to get that smoke, which is unsafe and unhealthy. So you can see how you can lose the ability to burn within these preserves as the area around becomes urbanized. And that's when you have to resort to mechanical treatment. And when you do that, you lose some of the biodiversity of the site because there are scrub plants that have to have fire to set seed. And if you are participating in our on-site training in Marion County at a site we call the Triangle, you will see another example of this mechanical treatment. And then there's climate change. This figure is from a recently published modeling study that was done by National Audubon. And you can see how scrub habitats expected to change due to higher temperatures. So there will be losses in some parts of the state and range gained in other parts. It's possible that the scrub could become too hot for scrub jays. What's not clear yet on the Florida Peninsula is whether a future that includes higher temperatures would include more or less rainfall. The difference would be hotter and more arid versus hotter and more humid. And we don't know which scenario will play out, so we don't know how climate change will affect scrub jays. No doubt the heat will affect their food supply, but the rainfall uncertainty makes it difficult to project how the habitat will change and how jays will survive or adapt. So I'll just quickly share a little bit about translocation. Translocation has been used since the 1980s to try to help grow Florida scrub jay populations. Success has been variable. Right now, there's an effort ongoing to move Florida scrub jays from Ocala National Forest, which, if you remember, that's where the biggest population in the state is, to other public lands. And to translocate, you'll have to capture the birds. So here are a couple different types of traps that are used. And translocation efforts usually capture and move the whole family group. When the birds are captured, they're transported to the new site and sometimes kept in a hacking cage for a period of time, which is what's here on the right. Researchers are now experimenting with a soft release, which is what the hacking cage is, versus a hard release. In a hard release, researchers would just drive the birds to the new site and then open the carrier without any retention period in the hacking cage and let them go. The possible advantage of having a retention period in the hacking cage is that the birds will get more used to the sights and sounds and be more likely to stay at their new site because it's more familiar. Once the birds are released, then they are monitored daily. They all get banded when they're translocated, and some may also be outfitted with tracking devices to help researchers locate them. This is really labor intensive, but it's also really important because we need to know if the birds stay at the new site or leave to understand the success of the translocation. If the birds do stay, the next question is, will they breed? And will the helper birds be able to integrate and find mates in other families? Florida scrub jays will typically not pair up with family members, so having other family groups nearby is a requirement. And there have been some case studies about scrub jay translocations that have taught us that the timing of the translocation matters. Summer seems to be the optimal time before scrub jays start to harvest and cache acorns. If they're transferred later, then they will lose that winter food supply and they might not have time and opportunity to build it up at the new site. And we also know that moving family groups, including helpers, is most effective. Moving juveniles without their family groups doesn't work. And here are some of the sites where there have been recent successes in translocation. Seminole State Forest, Rock Springs Run State Park and ongoing at Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And the goal of translocation is both to grow scrub jay populations, but also help maintain and increase genetic diversity. One last thing I want to talk about is Audubon's work with partners. These two people are from the Florida Trail Association. That was just to check and make sure everyone's still awake. But Audubon has partnered with a lot of different organizations, including the Florida Trail Association, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Florida Park Service, Quest Ecology, and even Wells Fargo Bank to work with land managers to cut down sand pines. And this is important because the sand pines can hide predators, especially Cooper's hawks and great horned owls. This picture shows an early scrub restoration project that actually happened in an old lightning fire scar, which is the pale part of the photo. Where the red line is, there were fringes of tall sand pines. So to expand the area used by Florida scrub jays, we harvested sand pines all along the perimeter of that old lightning scar. And this project also removed some sand pines from the interior as well. So this shows the before and after. On the before, you have really tall sand pines on the left, and then on the right, it's low and open, which is what the scrub jays like. And do the people look a little more exhausted on the left? I can't, or on the right? I can't tell. I'm sure they are. So that's all from me. That's a quick primer on Florida scrub jays. I am happy to answer any questions now. And yeah, then it looks like we'll have maybe time for like 10 minutes of questions and then a 10-minute break. And then we'll go into Jackie's presentation.
Just a reminder, if you have any questions, to type them in the chat. We'll just give Audrey a chance to drink something as she prepares to answer any questions you might have. It's possible you just covered it all.
It sounds like that might be the case.